The blizzard had been raging for 3 days when Sarah Mitchell realized she had nowhere left to go. Standing at the edge of Millbrook, with her 3-year-old triplets clinging to her worn coat, she watched the last of the townspeople turn their backs and disappear into the warmth of their homes. The sheriff's words still echoed in her mind. "You've got until nightfall, Mrs. Mitchell. The bank owns that house now." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Behind her, the wind howled across the plains with a fury that seemed to match the coldness she'd encountered from people she'd once called neighbors. Ahead lay nothing but endless wilderness, and the promise of a storm that meteorologists were calling the worst in 50 years. But somewhere in those mountains, watching through eyes that had seen too much suffering, stood a man who would change everything. Sarah Mitchell had never imagined her life would unravel so completely in the span of 18 months. Just 2 years ago, she'd been the wife of Millbrook's most respected carpenter, David Mitchell, living in a modest but comfortable home on Elm Street with their miracle triplets, Emma, Jake, and Lucy. The children had been born after 7 years of hoping and praying, and their arrival had seemed like the universe finally smiling down on the Mitchell family. David had worked tirelessly to provide for his growing family, taking on extra projects and weekend jobs to ensure they never wanted for anything. He'd been in the middle of expanding their small house, adding a proper nursery and playroom for the children when the accident happened. A scaffolding collapse at the Henderson construction site had taken him instantly, along with 2 other men from town. The funeral had been well attended, with half of Millbrook turning out to pay their respects to a man who'd touched so many lives through his craftsmanship and quiet generosity. Sarah remembered standing at the graveside, the triplets too young to understand why Daddy wasn't coming home anymore, while neighbors and friends offered their condolences and promises of support. Those promises had lasted exactly 3 months. The first sign of trouble came when the medical bills started arriving. David's insurance through the construction company had been minimal, and the emergency room visits, ambulance costs, and funeral expenses quickly depleted their small savings account. Sarah had tried to return to her job at the town library, but finding childcare for 3 toddlers in a town the size of Millbrook proved nearly impossible. The one daycare center charged more per month than she could make working full-time. She'd turned to the same neighbors who'd stood beside her at David's funeral, asking for help, watching the children just a few hours a day so she could work. Mrs. Henderson from next door had agreed initially, but after 2 weeks complained that the triplets were too much energy for someone her age. The Crawfords across the street had taken a turn, but their own teenage children resented the disruption to their routine. One by one, every door she knocked on found reasons to decline. The bank had been patient at first. Mr. Thornton, the branch manager, had known David personally and had initially agreed to defer payments on their mortgage while Sarah got back on her feet. But as months passed and Sarah's part-time library wages barely covered groceries and utilities, those deferrals turned into demands for full payment of back-due amounts. "I understand your situation, Mrs. Mitchell," Thornton had said during their final meeting, his sympathy clearly exhausted. "But the bank isn't a charity. We've given you every consideration possible. The foreclosure proceedings begin next week." Sarah had tried everything. She'd applied for every assistance program available, but the waiting lists were months long. She'd reached out to family, but David's parents had passed away years earlier, and her own sister in California was struggling with her own financial problems after a divorce. The church had provided some groceries and helped with a utility bill, but their resources were stretched thin across multiple families in need. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in November, when she received 3 notices in the same day. The eviction notice from the bank, a disconnection warning from the power company, and a certified letter from the state threatening to place the children in foster care if she couldn't provide adequate housing within 30 days. That night, after putting Emma, Jake, and Lucy to bed in their shared room, she'd already sold most of the furniture to pay for food. Sarah had sat at her kitchen table and cried until she had no tears left. The children had been asking why they couldn't go to the playground anymore, why they never had the snacks their friends talked about, why Mommy was always sad. At 3 years old, they were too young to understand bankruptcy and foreclosure, but old enough to sense that their world was crumbling around them. The town's attitude toward the Mitchell family had shifted gradually, then suddenly. At first, there had been genuine sympathy and offers of help. But as Sarah's financial situation became public knowledge through the small-town gossip network, sympathy turned to judgment. People began whispering about poor financial planning, about how David must not have been as responsible as everyone thought, about how Sarah should just give up the house and move somewhere more affordable. The whispers became pointed comments. Maybe she should consider what's best for those children, Mrs. Carlyle had said loudly enough for Sarah to hear at the grocery store. 3 babies and no father. That's too much for any woman to handle alone. Others nodded in agreement, their faces showing a mixture of pity and superiority that made Sarah's cheeks burn with shame. By the time winter arrived, the social isolation was nearly complete. Former friends crossed the street to avoid awkward conversations. The triplets were no longer invited to birthday parties or playdates. Even at the library, Sarah's co-workers treated her with the careful politeness reserved for someone they expected to disappear soon. The final humiliation came 3 days before the eviction, when Child Protective Services arrived at her door. Someone, Sarah never learned who, had called in a report claiming the children were being neglected, that they were often seen in clothes that didn't fit properly, that Sarah appeared unable to provide adequate care. The social worker, a stern woman named Patricia Vance, had walked through the nearly empty house with a clipboard, making notes about the lack of heat, the sparse food in the refrigerator, the children's worn clothing. Emma, Jake, and Lucy had huddled together on the couch, their large eyes watching. This stranger examined their home with obvious disapproval. "Mrs. Mitchell," Vance had said, settling her considerable bulk into one of the 2 remaining kitchen chairs. "I'm required to inform you that if suitable housing isn't secured within 72 hours, we'll have no choice but to place the children in temporary foster care while you get your situation resolved." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Foster care meant separation. No family in Millbrook was equipped to take all 3 children together. It meant her babies would be split up, placed with strangers, possibly never reunited. It meant she would have failed in the one thing that mattered most, keeping her family together. "I'm trying," Sarah had whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've applied everywhere, called everyone. I just need a little more time." Vance's expression had softened slightly, but her words remained firm. "The children's welfare has to come. First, Mrs. Mitchell. They need stability, proper nutrition, and adequate shelter. Love isn't enough if you can't provide the basics." That night, Sarah had packed their few remaining belongings into 2 suitcases and a handful of garbage bags. She'd loaded them into her 12-year-old Honda Civic, the one possession the bank couldn't touch because it was technically worthless, and driven aimlessly around Millbrook's empty streets while the triplets slept in their car seats. She'd considered driving to California to her sister's apartment, but 3 days on the road with 3 toddlers and less than $200 to her name seemed impossible. She'd thought about returning to her childhood home in Nebraska, but her parents' farm had been sold years ago after their deaths. Every option seemed to lead to the same dead end. She had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. The storm had begun. That morning, with a few scattered snowflakes that quickly intensified into a full blizzard. The Weather Service was calling it a historic storm system, with predictions of 3 feet of snow and temperatures dropping to dangerous levels. The mayor had issued a shelter-in-place order for all residents. But Sarah Mitchell had no shelter to place herself in. She'd spent the last night in the house lying awake on the floor of what had once been her bedroom, listening to the wind rattle the windows and watching her 3 children sleep peacefully, unaware that morning would bring another upheaval in their young lives. Emma, with her father's dark hair and serious expression, had been clutching her worn, stuffed rabbit. Jake, the only boy and always the protector of his sisters, had spread his small arms wide as if trying to shield Lucy, who slept curled into the smallest possible ball, her thumb in her mouth. At dawn, Sheriff Coleman had arrived with the bank representative and the locksmith. He'd been apologetic but firm. The family had to be out by noon, regardless of the weather conditions. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he'd said, using her first name because he'd known her since she was a child. "But I can't make exceptions. The law is the law." She'd loaded the children into the car, their questions becoming more insistent as they drove away from the only home they'd ever known. "Where are we going, Mommy?" Emma had asked, her voice small and worried. "When are we coming back?" Sarah had tried to sound confident, upbeat. "We're going on an adventure," she'd told them, though the words felt like lies on her tongue. "We're going to find a new place to live, somewhere special." Now, standing at the edge of Millbrook with the storm intensifying around them, and darkness approaching, Sarah finally allowed herself to face the truth she'd been avoiding. She was out of options. Behind her was a town that had turned its back on her family. Ahead was wilderness and weather that could kill them all before morning. The triplets were getting restless in the car, their voices rising in confusion and discomfort. The heater hadn't worked properly in months, and their breath was beginning to fog the windows. Sarah knew she had to make a decision soon, but every choice seemed to lead to disaster. She looked up at the mountains looming in the distance, their peaks already shrouded in snow and cloud. Somewhere up there, beyond the reach of civilized judgment and bureaucratic deadlines, maybe there was still hope. Maybe there was still someone who remembered what it meant to help a neighbor in need. What Sarah Mitchell didn't know was that someone was indeed watching from those mountains. Someone who had seen her family's struggles from afar and had been preparing for this moment. Someone whose own understanding of loss and displacement had created a fierce determination to prevent others from experiencing the same pain. The storm was getting worse, but their real journey was just beginning. Thomas Whitehorse had been tracking the Mitchell family situation for weeks, not through gossip or official channels, but through the kind of careful observation that had kept his people alive for generations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. From his cabin, high in the Bighorn Mountains, he'd watched through binoculars as the bank representatives measured the property, as the social worker made her visits, as neighbors turned away when Sarah approached their doors. At 62, Thomas moved through the world like a shadow. His weathered hands bore the calluses of decades spent working with wood and stone. His dark eyes held the patience of someone who understood that all things happened in their proper time. He'd learned long ago that the most powerful actions were often the quietest ones, taken without fanfare or expectation of recognition. His own story was one that Millbrook preferred to forget. 30 years earlier, Thomas had been Dr. Thomas Whitehorse, a respected physician who'd returned to his hometown after medical school with dreams of serving both the reservation and the broader community. He'd opened a practice that treated everyone equally, regardless of their ability to pay, and had become known for making house calls in the most remote areas during emergencies. The trouble had started when he'd refused to falsify medical records for the county's largest employer, Hartwell Mining Company. Workers had been showing signs of lung damage from exposure to silica dust, but the company had pressured Thomas to attribute their symptoms to other causes. When he'd insisted on documenting the real source of their illnesses and testifying in the subsequent lawsuits, Hartwell had used its considerable influence to destroy his career. Medical licenses could be revoked for surprisingly minor infractions when the right people applied pressure. Suddenly, Thomas had found himself facing charges of prescription irregularities, patient confidentiality violations, and billing improprieties. None of the charges would have stood up in court, but the legal battle had drained his resources and his reputation long before any trial could take place. The final blow had come when the hospital board, dominated by Hartwell executives and their allies, had voted to revoke his privileges. Without hospital access, his practice had become unsustainable. Within 6 months, Dr. Thomas Whitehorse had become just another unemployed man in a town that had made it clear he was no longer welcome. Rather than leave, Thomas had chosen to disappear into the mountains that had sheltered his ancestors for centuries. He'd used his remaining savings to purchase a remote plot of land far from any road, and had spent the next 3 decades living off the grid, supporting himself through careful hunting, fishing, and the occasional sale of handcrafted furniture to distant markets. The solitude hadn't made him bitter, it had refined him. Without the distractions of modern life, Thomas had reconnected with skills his grandfather had taught him as a boy. He could track animals through terrain that would challenge experienced hunters. He could build structures that would stand for generations using only hand tools and materials from the land. He could move through the forest without leaving a trace, observe without being seen, help without being known. Over the years, there had been others like Sarah Mitchell, families facing impossible situations, individuals abandoned by systems that claimed to protect them. Thomas had developed a network of assistants that operated entirely in shadows. An anonymous envelope of cash appeared in a mailbox when eviction loomed. A truck broke down in exactly the right place to be discovered by someone who desperately needed transportation. Food appeared on doorsteps during the hardest winters, with no note or explanation. The people of Millbrook had no idea that their cast-off doctor had become their silent guardian, helping those the community had decided weren't worth saving. Sarah Mitchell's situation had caught his attention differently than the others. Perhaps it was the ages of her children, the same age his own son would have been if the boy had lived past his 3rd birthday. Perhaps it was the particular cruelty of a town turning against a widow in her moment of greatest need. Or perhaps it was simply that Thomas recognized in Sarah the same stubborn determination that had kept him going through his own darkest hours. He'd been preparing for weeks, knowing that the convergence of the eviction and the predicted storm would create a crisis that would require more than anonymous assistance. This situation would demand direct intervention, something Thomas hadn't done in over a decade. The compound he'd been building in secret was located 15 miles deep into the wilderness, accessible only by a path that required knowledge of landmarks invisible to casual observers. It had taken him 5 years to complete, working entirely by hand to avoid attracting attention from aircraft or satellite surveillance. The main lodge was built into a natural depression in the mountainside, its roof covered with native vegetation that rendered it nearly invisible from above. Solar panels disguised as rock formations provided electricity. A natural spring had been channeled to provide fresh water. The structure itself was a masterpiece of sustainable engineering, designed to remain comfortable year-round while leaving virtually no environmental footprint. There were separate sleeping quarters, a common area with a massive stone fireplace, a workshop, and a root cellar stocked with enough preserved food to last through the longest winter. Thomas had built it with the intention of eventually housing families like the Mitchells, people who needed time and space to rebuild their lives away from the judgment and interference of society. He'd furnished it carefully over the years, acquiring children's furniture and toys through discreet purchases in distant towns, preparing for the day when his refuge would serve its intended purpose. When the storm began that morning, Thomas had loaded his truck with supplies and positioned himself where he could observe the final confrontation between Sarah and the authorities. He'd watched Sheriff Coleman's reluctant enforcement of the eviction, had seen the bank representative's cold efficiency, had noted the complete absence of any community member offering assistance. As Sarah's Honda Civic pulled away from Elm Street, for the last time, Thomas had begun his own careful approach to town. He knew every back road and deer path within 50 miles, routes that would allow him to reach the edge of Millbrook without being seen by anyone who might recognize him. Now, as the blizzard intensified and visibility dropped to mere yards, Thomas parked his truck in a grove of trees and began his approach on foot. The Honda was easy to spot, the only vehicle foolish enough to be out in conditions that had every sensible person locked safely indoors. Through the swirling snow, he could see Sarah standing beside the car, her slight figure nearly lost in the chaos of wind and ice. The children were visible through the car's rear window, 3 small faces pressed against the glass, their eyes wide with the kind of fear that came from sensing their mother's desperation, even when they couldn't understand its source. Thomas felt something tighten in his chest as he watched them, not just sympathy, but a recognition of responsibility that went deeper than mere compassion. He approached slowly, understanding that his sudden appearance would likely terrify a woman who had every reason to be suspicious of strangers. Thomas had learned long ago that his presence could be intimidating. He stood well over 6 feet tall, and his weathered features and long grey hair often caused people to make assumptions about his intentions. When he was still 20 feet away, Sarah noticed him. Her body tensed, and she moved instinctively closer to the car door, ready to shield her children from whatever threat this stranger might represent. Thomas raised his hands, palms forward, in the universal gesture of peaceful intent. "Mrs. Mitchell," he called out, his voice carrying clearly despite the wind. "My name is Thomas Whitehorse. I've come to help." Sarah's eyes narrowed, searching his face for signs of deception or danger. "I don't know you," she called back, her voice steady despite her obvious fear. "How do you know my name?" "I know your situation," Thomas replied, moving a few steps closer but stopping when he saw her tense further. "I know you have nowhere to go tonight, and I know this storm will kill you and your children if you try to sleep in that car." The bluntness of his words seemed to shock Sarah more than gentler persuasion might have. She glanced back at the triplets, then at the darkening sky, where snow was now falling so heavily that the distant mountains had disappeared entirely. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice carrying the wariness of someone who had learned that help always came with a price. "To offer you shelter," Thomas said simply. "Safe, warm shelter for you and your children, for as long as you need it." Sarah studied his face, searching for the catch she was certain existed. "Why would you help us? You don't even know us." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering how much truth she was ready to hear. "Because 30 years ago, this town decided I wasn't worth helping either," he said finally. "Because those children deserve better than freezing to death. Because adults can't see past their own prejudices." Something in his tone seemed to reach Sarah in a way that reassurance might not have. She looked again at Emma, Jake, and Lucy, saw how their breath was beginning to fog inside the car, despite their winter coats, saw how Lucy was starting to cry from cold and confusion. "Where?" she asked, the single word carrying all her desperate hope and lingering fear. "Somewhere safe," Thomas said. "Somewhere they can't find you unless you want to be found." Sarah closed her eyes, and Thomas could see her weighing impossible choices. Stay and face child services, foster care, and the certainty of her family being torn apart. Try to drive through the storm and risk all their lives on treacherous mountain roads, or trust a stranger who appeared from nowhere with promises that sounded too good to be true. When she opened her eyes, Thomas saw that she'd made her decision. "What do I need to do?" she asked. Thomas moved closer, his movements careful and non-threatening. "Leave the car here," he said. "Take only what you can carry. I'll come back for the rest tomorrow when the storm passes." Sarah began gathering their essential belongings, her movements quick and efficient, despite her obvious exhaustion. She woke the triplets gently, explaining that they were going with the nice man to a warm place where they could sleep safely. The children, trusting their mother's judgment even in their confusion, allowed themselves to be bundled into extra layers of clothing. Thomas had brought a large backpack and helped Sarah distribute their belongings between it and the bags she could manage. Emma, the most alert of the triplets, studied Thomas with serious dark eyes that reminded him painfully of his own lost child. "Are you going to hurt us?" she asked, with the directness that only young children could manage. Thomas knelt down to her level, meeting her gaze steadily. "No," he said simply. "I'm going to keep you safe." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because Emma nodded solemnly and took his offered hand. Jake and Lucy, following their sister's lead, allowed Thomas to help them from the car without protest. The journey to Thomas's truck took 20 minutes through snow that was now knee-deep in places. Thomas carried Lucy, who had fallen asleep against his shoulder, while Sarah managed Emma and Jake. The children were remarkably resilient, asking questions about the snow and the trees rather than complaining about the cold or the difficult. Walking. When they reached the truck, a sturdy four-wheel drive vehicle equipped for exactly this kind of emergency, Thomas settled the family inside and started the engine. The heater began working immediately, filling the cab with blessed warmth. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, as Thomas navigated carefully away from town, following what appeared to be little more than a deer path through the forest. "Home," Thomas said quietly, the word carrying more meaning than Sarah could yet understand. Behind them, Millbrook disappeared into the storm, its lights fading until there was nothing visible but snow and darkness. Ahead lay a journey into wilderness that would change all their lives in ways none of them could imagine. For the first time in months, Sarah Mitchell allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be all right. The truck climbed steadily through terrain that seemed impossible in the growing darkness and swirling snow. Thomas navigated by memory and instinct, following switchbacks and narrow passages that would have been treacherous in daylight, let alone in the middle of a blizzard. The headlights carved a small cone of visibility through the white chaos, revealing glimpses of towering pines and rocky outcroppings that appeared and vanished like ghosts. Sarah gripped the door handle, her knuckles white with tension as the vehicle lurched and swayed over hidden obstacles. Beside her, the triplets had fallen into an exhausted sleep despite the rough ride, their small bodies pressed together for warmth. Emma's head rested against Jake's shoulder, while Lucy curled into the smallest possible space between them, her thumb finding its way to her mouth, even in sleep. "How much further?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible over the wind howling outside. "Another hour," Thomas replied, his hands steady on the wheel despite the challenging conditions. "The path gets easier once we reach the ridge." Sarah studied his profile in the dim light from the dashboard. There was something about Thomas Whitehorse that defied easy categorization. His clothes were well made but practical, his truck obviously maintained with care despite its age. He moved with the confidence of someone completely at home in this wilderness, yet his speech carried the education of someone who had lived in a very different world. "You said the town decided you weren't worth helping," Sarah said carefully. "What happened?" Thomas was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if he'd heard her question. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one carried weight. "I was a doctor," he said. "Came back here after medical school, thinking I could make a difference, thought I could serve both my people on the reservation and the broader community." He paused as the truck navigated around a fallen tree. "Turns out some truths are too expensive for small towns to afford." Sarah waited, sensing there was more to the story. "The mining company was poisoning its workers," Thomas continued. "Silica dust, lung damage that would kill them slowly over years. When I refused to lie about the cause of their symptoms, they made sure I couldn't practice medicine anywhere in the state." "That's terrible," Sarah said, meaning it. "It taught me something important," Thomas replied. "Sometimes the people who need help most are the ones society has decided don't deserve it." The truck crested a ridge, and suddenly the violence of the storm seemed to ease slightly. They were above the worst of the wind now, following a path that wound between massive rock formations that provided some shelter from the driving snow. The headlights illuminated what looked like natural stone pillars, carved by centuries of weather into fantastic shapes. "We're almost there," Thomas said, and Sarah could hear relief in his voice. 20 minutes later, the headlights swept across what appeared to be a solid wall of stone and pine trees. Thomas pulled the truck into a space that seemed too narrow to accommodate it, then got out and walked to what Sarah had assumed was solid rock. To her amazement, he pushed against it, and a section swung inward, revealing it to be a camouflaged door. "Stay here for a moment," Thomas said, disappearing into the darkness beyond the opening. Lights began to flicker inside, warm and welcoming. Thomas returned and began helping Sarah gather the children and their belongings. "Welcome to your new home," he said simply. Sarah stepped through the hidden entrance and stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The space beyond was unlike anything she had expected. The main room was enormous, with a vaulted ceiling supported by massive wooden beams. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, already crackling with warmth that reached every corner of the space. The furniture was handcrafted but comfortable, arranged in conversation areas that invited relaxation. But it was the attention to detail that truly amazed her. There were children's books on low shelves, toys scattered in corners as if waiting for small hands to discover them, a rocking chair positioned perfectly for bedtime stories. Someone had not only built this refuge, they had designed it specifically for families like hers. "How is this possible?" Sarah whispered, settling the triplets on a couch near the fireplace. Thomas was already moving around the space, adjusting thermostats and checking systems with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew every inch of the place. 5 years of planning, 10 years of building, he said. Solar power, natural spring water, geothermal heating, everything we need to be completely self-sufficient. Emma stirred awake and looked around with wide eyes. "Is this heaven?" she asked, her 3-year-old logic trying to process surroundings that seemed too perfect to be real. Thomas smiled, the first time Sarah had seen his weathered features soften. "No, sweetheart, this is just a safe place where you can sleep, without being cold." Jake and Lucy began to wake as well, their natural curiosity overcoming their exhaustion as they took in their new surroundings. Lucy spotted the toys immediately and made a beeline for a wooden dollhouse that was clearly handmade with extraordinary care. "Are these for us?" Jake asked, approaching a set of wooden blocks that formed an elaborate castle. "They're for whoever needs them," Thomas replied. "Right now, that's you." While the children explored, Thomas showed Sarah through the rest of the compound. There were 3 bedrooms, each furnished with obvious thought for comfort and privacy. A kitchen that was both modern and efficient, stocked with enough food to last months. A bathroom with a deep tub that made Sarah realize she hadn't had a proper bath in weeks. "The workshop is through there," Thomas explained, indicating a doorway, at the far end of the main room. "That's where I do my furniture making. The root cellar is below us. That's where we keep the long-term food storage. Sarah turned to face him, questions crowding her mind. Why? She asked. Why build all this? Why help us? Thomas settled into a chair near the fireplace, watching as the triplets continued their exploration. Lucy had discovered a basket of wooden animals and was setting up an elaborate zoo on the floor. Emma was examining each book on the children's shelves with the serious attention of someone who understood their value. Jake had found a set of musical instruments and was experimenting with a small wooden flute. My son would have been their age, Thomas said quietly, if he'd lived. Sarah felt her heart contract. I'm sorry. His mother and I were very young. She was from the reservation. I was finishing medical school. When she got pregnant, both our families were disappointed. Thomas watched the fire for a moment. We tried to make it work, but between the cultural differences and the financial pressure, things fell apart. She took the baby back to her family when he was 6 months old. He was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might not continue. Visited when I could, but it wasn't enough. He got sick when he was 2, pneumonia that should have been treatable. But the reservation clinic didn't have the right equipment. And by the time they got him to a hospital with proper facilities, it was too late. Sarah reached out instinctively and touched his hand. That wasn't your fault. Maybe not directly, Thomas said. But I learned something that day about how systems fail the people who need them most, about how geography and poverty and prejudice can kill as surely as any disease. He looked up at the children, who had now discovered a collection of puzzles and were working together to solve them. When I built this place, I kept thinking about families like his mother's, like yours, people who fall through the cracks because they don't fit into neat categories that bureaucrats can understand. Sarah felt tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed in months finally beginning to fall. I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me yet, Thomas said with a slight smile. Wait until you've been here long enough to get tired of my cooking. That first night, Sarah helped the triplets settle into the largest bedroom, which Thomas had clearly designed for a family. There were 3 small beds arranged around a central nightlight, shelves at child height filled with books and soft toys, and a window that looked out into the forest. Even exhausted as they were, the children were reluctant to sleep in yet. Another unfamiliar place. Will we have to leave tomorrow? Emma asked, her voice small and worried. Sarah looked at Thomas, who was standing in the doorway. Not unless you want to, he said gently. This is your home now, for as long as you need it. Jake sat up in his bed. Forever? If that's what it takes, Thomas replied. Over the following days, as the storm raged outside and the compound remained, a warm sanctuary, Sarah began to understand the true scope of what Thomas had created. The solar power system was sophisticated enough to run everything they needed. The water system provided hot showers and clean drinking water. The food storage included not just canned goods, but fresh vegetables from a small greenhouse that was built into the southern face of the mountain. More impressive than the technology was the thought that had gone into every detail. The children's clothes in the bedroom closets came in multiple sizes, as if Thomas had anticipated housing children of various ages. The books ranged from picture books to early readers, perfectly suited for the triplets' developing skills. The toys were all handmade from natural materials, built to last, and designed to encourage creativity rather than passive consumption. How did you know what children would need? Sarah asked one morning, as she watched Thomas show Jake how to use a simple woodworking tool. Research, Thomas replied. Lots of trips to stores in distant cities, conversations with teachers and child development specialists who didn't know why I was asking. He guided Jake's small hands as they sanded a piece of wood smooth. I wanted to be ready for whenever the right family showed up. Sarah was learning to navigate her new reality as well. After months of constant financial stress and social isolation, the simple ability to provide for her children's basic needs felt almost miraculous. The triplets were eating regular meals, sleeping in warm beds, and beginning to laugh again in ways they hadn't since their father's death. But perhaps most importantly, they were safe. There were no social workers threatening to separate them, no neighbors judging their circumstances, no bills arriving daily to remind Sarah of her failures. For the first time since David's death, she could focus on being their mother rather than fighting for their survival. Thomas had established routines that gave structure to their days, while allowing for the flexibility that life with 3 toddlers required. Mornings began with breakfast together around the large kitchen table, followed by educational activities that felt more like games than lessons. Thomas had a gift for explaining complex concepts in ways that captured the children's imagination, teaching them about solar energy by following the path of sunlight through the panels, showing them water conservation by tracing the springs. Journey from source to tap. Afternoons were for creative play and exploration. The compound was large enough for the children to have adventures without ever being out of sight, and Thomas had designed numerous hiding places and climbing structures that turned the space into an endless playground. He'd even created a small library nook where Sarah could read to all 3 children at once, their faces lit by the warm glow of the fireplace. Evenings were for family time, though Sarah was still adjusting to the idea that Thomas considered himself part of their family unit. He never presumed, never overstepped, but his presence had become essential to their new normal. He was patient with the children's questions, gentle with their fears, and amazingly creative in finding ways to tire them out before bedtime. "You're good with them," Sarah told him one evening after the triplets had finally fallen asleep. "They're easy to love," Thomas replied simply. Sarah realized that somewhere in the past week she had stopped thinking of this as temporary shelter and started thinking of it as home. The feeling should have scared her. After all, she barely knew Thomas Whitehorse, and her life had been built on the foundation that security was something that could be lost at any moment. But watching him with her children, seeing the care he'd put into creating this refuge, understanding the depth of his commitment to helping families like hers, Sarah found herself beginning to trust in a way she hadn't thought possible anymore. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside their hidden sanctuary, a new kind of family was quietly taking root. 3 weeks into their mountain sanctuary, Sarah Mitchell discovered that Thomas Whitehorse was not the hermit she had initially assumed him to be. While he lived far from civilization, he maintained a complex network of connections that spanned multiple states and included people from every walk of life imaginable. The revelation came when a package arrived at their hidden compound, delivered by a man named Carlos Rodriguez, who appeared one morning on snowshoes, carrying supplies that seemed impossibly heavy for the distance he must have traveled. Carlos was a forest ranger from Colorado, who spoke with Thomas in a mixture of English and Spanish, discussing weather patterns and trail conditions with the familiarity of old friends. "Thomas helped my family during the wildfires 3 years ago," Carlos explained to Sarah as he shared their morning coffee. "My wife and kids had nowhere to go when our house burned. Thomas arranged temporary housing, connected us with resources we didn't even know existed." After Carlos left, Sarah confronted Thomas about the extent of his secret network. "How many people do you help?" she asked directly. Thomas considered the question while he prepared lunch for the triplets, who were busy building an elaborate fort out of blankets and furniture in the main room. "Hard to say exactly," he replied. "It's not organized like a charity or anything official, more like people helping people when the regular systems fail." Over the following days, Sarah began to understand that Thomas had created something unprecedented, an underground network of mutual aid that operated entirely outside government agencies and established charities. Forest rangers like Carlos provided intelligence about remote areas and emergency situations. Truck drivers carried supplies and messages across state lines. Teachers identified families in crisis before situations became desperate. Medical professionals provided care when people couldn't access traditional health care. How do you coordinate all this without computers or phones? Sarah asked, fascinated by the logistics of such an operation. Dead drops, coded messages, people who check on other people, Thomas explained. The same methods indigenous communities have used for centuries to share information and resources. He smiled slightly. Amazing what you can accomplish when you don't need to document everything for bureaucrats. The network had been Thomas's response to his own experience of being abandoned by official institutions. After losing his medical license and watching his son die from preventable causes, he had dedicated himself to creating alternatives for people who fell through society's cracks. The mountain compound was just one of several refugees he maintained across the region, each designed for different types of emergencies. There's a cabin in Montana for single mothers fleeing domestic violence, he explained. A converted barn in Wyoming for families dealing with medical bankruptcies, a farmhouse in Colorado for elderly people who can't afford long-term care. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the scope of what Thomas had accomplished. How do you pay for all this? Furniture sales mostly, Thomas said, gesturing toward his workshop. Custom pieces for wealthy clients in Denver and Salt Lake City. They pay premium prices for authentic rustic craftsmanship, never knowing their money is funding a shadow welfare system. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. The same wealthy class that supported policies denying help to struggling families was unknowingly financing Thomas's efforts to provide exactly that help. She was beginning to understand that Thomas Whitehorse was not just a kind hermit, but a strategic thinker who had found ways to redirect resources from those who had plenty to those who had nothing. As winter deepened, Sarah found herself taking on more responsibilities within the compound. Thomas had clearly been operating alone for so long that he'd developed systems for everything, but having a family in residence created new challenges and opportunities. Sarah's background as a librarian proved invaluable. She had skills in organization, research, and education that complemented Thomas's practical abilities. She began cataloging the compound's extensive collection of books and resources, creating a system that would make information easily accessible to future families who might need specific knowledge. She also started developing educational curricula that could help children who might be staying at the refuge for extended periods, ensuring they wouldn't fall behind academically while their families rebuilt their lives. The triplets were thriving in ways that amazed Sarah. Emma's natural leadership abilities emerged as she took charge of organizing games and activities for her siblings. Jake's mechanical aptitude became apparent as he spent hours in Thomas's workshop, learning to use tools with careful supervision. Lucy's artistic talents flourished as she filled notebook after notebook with drawings of their mountain home and the wildlife they observed from the windows. But it was their relationship with Thomas that truly warmed Sarah's heart. The children had quickly overcome their initial shyness and now treated him with the comfortable familiarity they would have shown a beloved grandfather. He, in turn, displayed endless patience with their questions, boundless energy for their games, and genuine interest in their developing personalities. "Uncle Thomas," Emma said one morning at breakfast, using the title the children had spontaneously adopted, "why don't other kids have houses like this?" Thomas set down his coffee cup and gave the question the serious consideration he always showed their inquiries. Because most people don't know how to build them, he said, and because the people who make the rules think everyone should live the same way. That's silly, Jake declared. Our house is better than all the houses in town. It's different, Thomas corrected gently. Different isn't always better or worse, just different. Sarah appreciated how Thomas never spoke bitterly about Millbrook or tried to turn the children against their former community. Despite everything that had happened, he maintained that people were generally good, but sometimes got confused about what really mattered. One afternoon, while the children napped, Sarah and Thomas sat by the fire, discussing practical matters. The storm had finally passed, and the compound's communication systems indicated that the outside world was slowly returning to normal operations. Roads were being cleared, power restored to areas that had lost it, and emergency services resuming. Regular functions. They'll be looking for us soon, Sarah said quietly. Child services, the bank, maybe even the police. Thomas nodded. I've been thinking about that. There are options. He pulled out a detailed map of the region and spread it across the coffee table. If you want to disappear completely, I can arrange new identities, relocation to a place where no one will ask questions. He pointed to several marked locations. We have safe houses across 4 states, people who can provide employment and housing while you start over. Sarah studied the map, seeing possibilities she hadn't dared imagine weeks earlier. What about the legal issues, the foreclosure, the custody threats? All of that depends on them being able to find you, Thomas replied. And people who don't want to be found can stay lost for a very long time, especially with the right help. The prospect of complete freedom was tempting, but Sarah found herself hesitating. What about Emma, Jake, and Lucy? They deserve to grow up as themselves, not hiding behind fake names. That's the other option, Thomas said. We fight. He pulled out a thick folder Sarah hadn't seen before. I've been documenting everything that happened to your family. The bank's illegal foreclosure practices, the town's failure to provide adequate social services, the systematic discrimination you faced. Thomas opened the folder to reveal photographs, legal documents, and detailed notes. I have friends who are investigative journalists, civil rights lawyers, social activists, people who know how to shine lights in dark corners. Sarah stared at the evidence Thomas had compiled. You've been investigating my case? I've been investigating the systems that failed you, Thomas corrected. Your situation isn't unique. It's part of a pattern of how communities abandon families in crisis. But patterns can be exposed, and exposure can force change. The folder contained documentation that went far beyond Sarah's individual situation. Thomas had compiled evidence of housing discrimination, inadequate social services, and economic policies that systematically disadvantaged single mothers. He'd identified similar cases across the region, building a comprehensive picture of institutional failure. There are lawyers who would take this case pro bono, Thomas explained. Organizations that specialize in fighting exactly these kinds of injustices. If you're willing to go public with your story, we might be able to prevent what happened to you from happening to other families. Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and terror at the prospect. Going public means giving up our privacy, our safety here. Not necessarily, Thomas said. The legal action would take months, maybe years. You could continue living here while the case progresses, travel to meetings and hearings as needed. The compound would remain your base of operations. Over the next few days, Sarah wrestled with the decision. The safe choice was to disappear completely, to take new identities and start fresh somewhere far from Millbrook's reach. But the fighter in her, the same determination that had kept her going through months of increasing desperation, rebelled against the idea of running away without consequences for those who had failed her family. She thought about other mothers, in situations similar to hers, facing the same impossible choices between keeping their families together and meeting the arbitrary requirements of systems designed to help. She thought about children being separated from parents who loved them simply because love wasn't enough to overcome poverty and prejudice. "I want to fight," she told Thomas one evening after the triplets had gone to bed. "Not just for us, but for all the families who don't have someone like you to save them." Thomas smiled, and Sarah saw approval in his eyes. "I was hoping you'd say that." The next morning, Thomas began making calls on a satellite phone Sarah hadn't known he possessed. Within hours, he'd connected with a civil rights attorney in Denver, a family law specialist in Seattle, and a journalist who specialized in exposing governmental failures. Each conversation was brief but intense, Thomas speaking in the coded language of people who understood that their work often challenged powerful interests. "Margaret Chen is driving up from Denver tomorrow," Thomas informed Sarah. "She's one of the best civil rights lawyers in the region, and she thinks your case could set important precedents." Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness. "What will I need to tell her?" "Everything," Thomas said simply. "The whole truth, no matter how painful or embarrassing. Margaret needs to understand every detail if she's going to build a case that can't be torn apart in court." That night, Sarah lay awake thinking about the journey that had brought her family to this point. 6 months ago, she'd been a grieving widow trying to hold her life together through conventional means. She'd trusted systems, followed rules, and believed that if she just tried hard enough, everything would work out. Now she was living in a hidden mountain compound, planning to challenge those same systems through guerrilla legal warfare, supported by a network of people she was only beginning to understand. The transformation felt surreal, as if she'd stepped into someone else's life entirely, but watching her children sleep peacefully in their warm beds, knowing they were safe and loved and free from the constant uncertainty that had defined their early years, Sarah knew she'd made the right choices. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight her family was together and secure. Outside their hidden sanctuary, winter continued its reign over the mountains. But inside, plans were being made that would challenge everything Millbrook thought. It knew about justice, mercy, and the true meaning of community responsibility. Margaret Chen arrived at the compound on a Tuesday morning, navigating the treacherous mountain paths with the kind of focused determination that had made her one of the most feared civil rights attorneys in the western United States. At 55, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had spent decades forcing powerful institutions to answer uncomfortable questions. Sarah watched through the window as Margaret emerged from a modified jeep that looked capable of climbing vertical walls. Even from a distance, the attorney's presence commanded attention. She moved with purpose, her silver-streaked hair pulled back severely, her expensive winter gear somehow managing to look both practical and professional. "She's intimidating," Sarah murmured to Thomas, as they watched Margaret survey the compound's exterior with obvious appreciation. "She needs to be," Thomas replied. "The people you're going up against have unlimited resources and decades of experience, crushing families like yours. Margaret's the kind of lawyer who makes them nervous." When Margaret entered the compound, her first reaction was pure professional curiosity. She examined the solar panels, tested the water systems, and asked detailed questions about the compound's legal status and environmental impact. Only after satisfying herself that Thomas's refuge was completely legitimate did she turn her attention to Sarah's case. "Tell me everything," Margaret said, settling into a chair by the fireplace with a digital recorder and a yellow legal pad. "Start from your husband's death and don't leave out anything, no matter how minor it seems." For the next 4 hours, Sarah relived the worst period of her life in excruciating detail. Margaret's questions were precise and sometimes painful, forcing Sarah to examine aspects of her experience she'd tried to avoid thinking about. Why hadn't she applied for certain assistance programs? What exactly had each neighbor said when refusing to help? How had the bank's representatives behaved during their meetings? The triplets, sensing the serious nature of the adult conversation, played quietly in the far corner of the room, occasionally glancing over with the intuitive understanding that something important was happening. The foreclosure procedures were definitely irregular, Margaret said, reviewing documents Thomas had obtained through his network. Your husband had mortgage insurance that should have covered the payments for at least 6 months after his death. The bank never processed the claim. Sarah felt a familiar anger rising. They told me the insurance had been cancelled. It wasn't, Margaret said flatly. I've seen the original policy documents. Either the bank made a serious error or they deliberately concealed information to expedite the foreclosure. Thomas leaned forward. How serious are we talking? Federal banking violations, potentially fraud charges if we can prove intent, Margaret replied. Banks can't foreclose on properties when valid insurance claims are pending. They're required, by law, to investigate all potential coverage before beginning proceedings. Over the following days, Margaret worked with Thomas's network to gather additional evidence. The investigation revealed a pattern of behavior that went far beyond Sarah's individual case. Millbrook First National had been aggressively foreclosing on properties throughout the region, often cutting corners on required procedures and failing to inform homeowners of their rights. They've been particularly targeting single mothers and elderly homeowners, Margaret explained during one of their evening strategy sessions. People who are less likely to have legal representation or understand the complexity of foreclosure. In law, the bank's practices weren't just unethical, they were systematically illegal. Margaret's investigation uncovered dozens of cases where proper procedures had been ignored, insurance claims dismissed without investigation, and families evicted from homes they legally should have been able to keep. This is bigger than I initially thought, Margaret told Sarah. Your case could be the key to exposing a conspiracy that's affected hundreds of families across 3 states. But the legal strategy was only part of what Margaret had planned. She'd also brought Dr. Jessica Martinez, a child psychologist who specialized in family trauma, and David Park, an investigative journalist whose articles had exposed corruption in small-town governments across the Mountain West. Dr. Martinez spent several days observing the triplets and conducting gentle interviews designed to document the psychological impact of their experiences. Her findings were both heartbreaking and legally powerful. These children show clear signs of trauma, from housing instability and family separation threats, Dr. Martinez explained to the assembled team. Emma exhibits hypervigilance, typical of children who've experienced parental stress. Jake displays protective behaviors beyond his developmental stage. Lucy shows regression patterns consistent with chronic insecurity. The psychological evaluation provided crucial evidence for the legal case, but it also served a therapeutic purpose. Dr. Martinez worked with Sarah to develop strategies for helping the children process their experiences in healthy ways. They're remarkably resilient, Dr. Martinez told Sarah privately. The stability they've found here has already begun reversing some of the trauma symptoms, but they'll need continued support as this legal process unfolds. David Park's investigation took a different approach, focusing on the broader economic and political factors that had enabled the bank's predatory practices. His research revealed connections between Millbrook's City Council, the bank's board of directors, and several real estate development companies that had profited from the wave of foreclosures. It's a classic pattern, David explained during one of their group meetings. Create an artificial housing crisis, buy properties at below-market prices, then develop or resell at significant profits. Your family was collateral damage in a much larger scheme. The journalists' investigation had uncovered communications between bank officials and local government representatives discussing strategies for accelerating urban renewal through aggressive foreclosure policies. The documents suggested a coordinated effort to displace lower-income families in favor of development projects that would benefit politically connected investors. "This is conspiracy territory," David said, his excitement evident as he reviewed financial records and email communications. "If I can prove coordination between the bank and city officials, this becomes a story about corruption at the highest levels of local government." As the investigation expanded, Sarah found herself at the center of something much larger than she'd imagined possible. What had begun as her family's personal tragedy was revealing systemic corruption that had destroyed countless other families across the region. The attention was overwhelming at times. Sarah had gone from being invisible to authorities who should have helped her to being the key witness in what Margaret described as potentially the most significant housing rights case in the state's history. "Are you ready for what this means?" Margaret asked during one of their private conversations. "Once we file these lawsuits, your life becomes public property. Every decision you've made, every mistake you've ever committed will be examined by defense attorneys whose job is to destroy your credibility." Sarah looked across the compound's main room, where Thomas was helping the triplets build an elaborate marble run while dinner simmered on the stove. The scene represented everything she'd been fighting to preserve: her children's safety, happiness, and right to grow up in a loving family. "I'm ready," she said firmly, "but I want protection for my children. Whatever happens to me, they don't deserve to be targeted." Margaret nodded approvingly. "We'll file for protective orders limiting media access to the children and sealing any court documents that reference them directly. Thomas's compound will remain confidential. It's not relevant to the legal issues, and revealing its location would serve no legitimate purpose." The strategy they developed was multi-pronged and aggressive. Margaret would file federal civil rights violations against the bank, fraud charges related to the insurance coverage, and a class action lawsuit on behalf of all families affected by the illegal foreclosure practices. David Park would publish his investigation into the corruption connections, creating public pressure for criminal investigations. Dr. Martinez would testify about the psychological damage caused to children by predatory housing practices. But perhaps most importantly, Thomas's network would ensure that other affected families receive support and legal representation. The case would become a platform for exposing and addressing the systematic failures that allowed vulnerable families to be exploited. "The goal isn't just justice for your family," Margaret explained. "It's changing the systems that created this situation in the first place." As preparations for the legal battle intensified, Sarah noticed changes in herself that went beyond her growing confidence in courtrooms and media interviews. Living in the compound had taught her skills she'd never imagined needing. She could now maintain solar power systems, preserve food for long-term storage, and navigate mountain terrain in challenging weather. More importantly, she'd learned to think strategically about problems that had once seemed insurmountable. The triplets were also developing in unexpected ways. Emma's natural leadership had evolved into genuine organizational skills as she helped coordinate activities for the various children who occasionally stayed at the compound with their families. Jake's mechanical aptitude had advanced to the point where he could assist Thomas with basic maintenance tasks around the compound. Lucy's artistic talents had expanded to include map-making and botanical illustration, documenting the flora and fauna around their mountain home. "They're learning things they never would have in traditional school," Sarah remarked to Thomas one evening as they watched the children demonstrate a pulley system Jake had designed to lift supplies to the compound's upper storage areas. "They're learning to be self-reliant," Thomas replied. "That's a skill that will serve them well, regardless of what happens with the legal case." The first major breakthrough came when David Park's investigation uncovered email communications between the bank president and the mayor of Millbrook, discussing specific properties targeted for foreclosure. The emails revealed that the bank had been providing advance notice of foreclosure proceedings to developers connected to city council members, allowing them to position themselves to purchase properties at artificially depressed prices. "This is smoking gun evidence of conspiracy," Margaret announced after reviewing the documents. "We're not just talking about sloppy banking practices anymore. This is criminal fraud involving public officials." The evidence was strong enough to attract attention from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division and the State Attorney General's office. What had begun as a civil rights case was expanding into a federal criminal investigation with implications that reached far beyond Millbrook. But success brought new dangers. As news of the investigation began to leak, Sarah received her first threatening phone call. "Drop the lawsuit or you'll regret it," the anonymous caller had said before hanging up. Thomas immediately upgraded the compound's security systems and established protocols for monitoring approach routes. Margaret arranged for federal protection services, but Sarah realized that her decision to fight back had put not just her own family at risk, but potentially everyone connected to Thomas's network. "We can still disappear," Thomas reminded her after the third threatening call. "New identities, relocation to somewhere they'll never find you." Sarah looked at the evidence files spread across the compound's main table, documents that represented months of investigation and the hopes of dozens of families who had been similarly victimized. Walking away now would mean abandoning not just her own quest for justice, but the possibility of preventing future families from experiencing the same devastation. "We've come too far to quit now," she said firmly. "Besides, someone needs to stand up to these people. If we don't, who will?" Outside the compound's protected walls, powerful people were scrambling to contain a scandal that threatened to expose decades of corruption. Inside, a widow and her 3 children continued preparing for a battle that would determine not just their own future, but the future of housing justice across the entire region. The stakes had never been higher, but Sarah Mitchell was no longer the desperate woman who had stood in a blizzard with nowhere to go. She had become something much more dangerous to those who preyed on the vulnerable. She had become someone with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The federal courthouse in Denver buzzed with unusual activity on the morning Sarah Mitchell was scheduled to give her deposition. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward a gray March sky, while reporters positioned themselves to catch glimpses of the key witnesses in what had become known as the Millbrook housing conspiracy. Sarah sat in Margaret Chen's rental car outside the courthouse, watching the media circus with a mixture of anxiety and determination. 6 months ago, she'd been invisible to the world, a struggling single mother whose problems were considered too small to matter. Now her testimony was expected to bring down a network of corruption that had operated with impunity for over a decade. "Remember," Margaret said, reviewing her notes one final time, "stick to the facts, answer only what's asked, and don't let the defense attorneys provoke you into emotional responses. They'll try to paint you as an unstable single mother who's fabricating claims for financial gain." Through the car window, Sarah could see Thomas approaching through the crowd. He'd insisted on accompanying her, despite Margaret's concerns about maintaining his anonymity. His presence had become essential to Sarah's confidence, a reminder that she wasn't facing this battle alone. The triplets had remained at the compound with Dr. Martinez, who was using their time together to continue documenting their recovery progress. At 4 years old now, Emma, Jake, and Lucy had adapted to their mountain life with the resilience that children often displayed when their basic needs for safety and love were consistently met. Inside the courthouse, the deposition room was smaller than Sarah had expected, dominated by a long conference table surrounded by attorneys representing various defendants. Bank President Robert Thornton sat at one end, his expensive suit unable to disguise the stress that had aged him visibly over the past months. Mayor Patricia Wainwright occupied another chair, her political composure cracking under the weight of federal investigation. The lead defense attorney, Harrison Blake, had a reputation for aggressive tactics that had made corporate executives wealthy while destroying the lives of whistleblowers and victims. His opening questions were designed to establish Sarah as an unreliable narrator whose memory couldn't be trusted. "Mrs. Mitchell, isn't it true that you were struggling with depression following your husband's death?" Blake asked, his tone suggesting sympathy while his words built toward character assassination. "I was grieving," Sarah replied evenly. "That's different from being mentally incapable of understanding legal documents or banking procedures." Margaret had prepared Sarah for exactly these attacks. The defense strategy would focus on portraying her as an emotional, irrational woman whose judgment had been compromised by trauma. They would suggest that she'd misunderstood perfectly legitimate banking procedures and was now seeking to blame others for her own financial irresponsibility. But Sarah's months at the compound had given her something the defense attorneys hadn't anticipated: unshakable confidence in her own worth and judgment. Living in Thomas's community of mutual aid had reminded her that intelligence and capability weren't measured by bank account balances or suburban conformity. "Isn't it true that you failed to maintain employment adequate to support your mortgage payments?" Blake continued, his questions following a predictable pattern. "I was denied childcare assistance that would have enabled full-time employment," Sarah responded. "I was also denied information about mortgage insurance that legally should have covered my payments for 6 months after my husband's death." The insurance issue was the cornerstone of Margaret's case. Documents obtained through federal subpoena had confirmed that David Mitchell's policy remained active at the time of his death and that the bank had never submitted the required claim paperwork. Instead, they'd accelerated foreclosure proceedings while telling Sarah that no coverage existed. "The bank maintains that you were properly notified of all available options," Blake insisted, but his confidence was wavering. The documentary evidence was overwhelming, and Sarah's composed responses were undermining his strategy of portraying her as an unreliable witness. The deposition continued for 8 hours, with breaks only for meals and legal consultations. Sarah answered hundreds of questions about her financial history, her husband's death, her interactions with bank officials, and her family's living situation following the foreclosure. The defense attorneys probed every aspect of her story, searching for inconsistencies or admissions that could be used against her in trial. But they also had to confront the evidence that Margaret's investigation had uncovered. Bank emails discussing the deliberate acceleration of foreclosure procedures, city council meeting minutes revealing discussions about encouraging population changes through housing policy, financial records showing suspicious patterns of property, transfers to companies owned by local officials' family members. "Are you familiar with Sunrise Development Corporation?" Margaret asked during her questioning of Mayor Wainwright. "It's a local business that contributes to our community's economic growth," Wainwright replied carefully. "Isn't it true that Sunrise Development is owned by your brother-in-law, and that it purchased 17 foreclosed properties from Millbrook First National at below-market prices during the same period when you were advocating for accelerated urban renewal policies?" The mayor's attorney immediately objected, but the question had already achieved its purpose. The pattern of corruption was becoming impossible to deny, even under the formal constraints of legal proceedings. During the lunch break, Sarah walked through downtown Denver with Thomas, grateful for the chance to escape the courthouse's oppressive atmosphere. The city's energy reminded her of possibilities that existed beyond small-town prejudice and corruption. "How do you think it's going?" she asked, as they sat in a small cafe several blocks from the media attention. "You're doing exactly what you need to do," Thomas replied. "You're telling the truth clearly and letting the evidence speak for itself." Sarah realized that her definition of success had evolved significantly over the past months. Initially, she'd wanted justice for her family's specific situation, acknowledgement that they'd been wronged, and compensation for their losses. But the investigation had revealed that her family's experience was part of a much larger pattern of institutional failure. "I keep thinking about all the other families," she said, "the ones who didn't have someone like you to help them." Thomas stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "That's exactly why this matters. Your case isn't just about getting your house back. It's about changing systems that create these situations in the first place." The afternoon session focused on the broader conspiracy allegations. Federal prosecutors had joined the proceedings, asking questions designed to establish criminal intent rather than just civil liability. Their interest had elevated the case from a local housing dispute to a federal investigation with potential prison sentences for multiple defendants. Sarah found herself describing conversations and interactions she'd barely understood at the time, but which now revealed clear patterns of deliberate deception. Bank officials who'd insisted that insurance claims were impossible, while knowing they'd never been submitted. City council members who'd expressed sympathy for her situation, while secretly planning to benefit from her family's displacement. "Mrs. Mitchell," prosecutor Janet Rodriguez asked, "when Mayor Wainwright told you that the city had no resources to assist families facing foreclosure, did she mention that the city had just approved a tax incentive package worth $3 million for developers purchasing distressed properties?" "No," Sarah replied. "She told me that helping individual families would set a precedent the city couldn't afford." The prosecutorial questioning revealed layers of hypocrisy that even Sarah hadn't fully grasped. The same officials who'd claimed that public assistance for struggling families was fiscally irresponsible had been simultaneously approving massive subsidies for developers who were profiting from those families' displacement. By the end of the day, Sarah felt emotionally drained but strategically confident. The defense attorney's attempts to portray her as an unreliable witness had been undermined by the documentary evidence and her composed responses to their aggressive questioning. Outside the courthouse, the media attention was intense. Reporters shouted questions about her living situation, her children's welfare, and her future plans. Margaret had coached Sarah to provide brief factual responses that wouldn't compromise the ongoing legal proceedings. "I'm grateful for the opportunity to seek justice, not just for my family, but for all the families who've been victimized by these illegal practices," Sarah told the assembled reporters. No family should face homelessness because public officials prioritize developer profits over housing rights. The drive back to the mountain compound took 3 hours, winding through terrain that had once seemed impossibly remote, but now felt like a journey home. Thomas drove in comfortable silence, understanding that Sarah needed time to process the day's emotional intensity. As they climbed toward their hidden sanctuary, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that winter night when she'd stood at Millbrook's edge with nowhere to go. The desperate woman who'd trusted a stranger in a blizzard had become someone capable of challenging powerful institutions in federal court. The compound's lights were visible long before they reached the concealed entrance, warm and welcoming against the mountain darkness. Inside, Dr. Martinez had prepared dinner while the triplets played elaborate games that seemed to involve most of the furniture in the main room. "Mommy!" Lucy called out, abandoning her architectural project to run into Sarah's arms. "Did you tell the judge about the bad bank people?" Sarah hugged her youngest daughter, amazed at how the children had processed their situation. They understood that their mother was fighting people who had been unfair to their family, but they weren't burdened by adult anxieties about outcomes and consequences. "I told them the truth about what happened to us," Sarah replied. "Just like we always tell each other the truth." Emma approached with the serious expression she wore when discussing important matters. "Are we going to have to leave our mountain house?" "Not unless we want to," Thomas assured her, settling into his favorite chair near the fireplace. "This will always be your home, no matter what happens with the court case." Dr. Martinez had been documenting the children's continued development during their extended stay at the compound. Her latest report showed remarkable progress in overcoming trauma symptoms, but also raised interesting questions about alternative approaches to child development. "They're thriving in ways that traditional educational environments might not have allowed," Dr. Martinez explained to Sarah that evening. "The multi-age interaction, the connection to natural environments, the emphasis on practical skills alongside academic learning, it's producing children who are both intellectually advanced and emotionally mature." Sarah realized that the compound had given her children something she'd never imagined possible: a childhood free from the economic anxieties and social pressures that had defined her own growing up. They were learning to think creatively, solve problems collaboratively, and view challenges as opportunities rather than threats. The legal battle would continue for months, possibly years. There would be more depositions, court appearances, and media scrutiny. The defendants would undoubtedly appeal any adverse verdicts, prolonging the process and testing Sarah's resolve. But sitting in their hidden mountain refuge, surrounded by the family that had formed around shared values of mutual aid and justice, Sarah felt confident about the future. Win or lose in court, they had already achieved something more valuable than legal vindication. They had created a life built on principles that couldn't be foreclosed upon or legislated away. Outside, spring was beginning to assert itself in the high country. Soon the mountain meadows would bloom with wildflowers, the streams would run full with snowmelt, and their hidden valley would display the natural abundance that had first drawn Thomas to choose this location for his experiment. In alternative living, the children were already making plans for their summer projects. Emma wanted to expand the garden. Jake hoped to build a treehouse in the grove behind the workshop, and Lucy had designs on creating an outdoor art studio where she could paint the changing seasons. For the first time since David's death, Sarah found herself looking forward to the future rather than simply trying to survive each day. Whatever the courts decided, her family had found something that couldn't be taken away from them. They had found home. 18 months after that desperate winter night, when Sarah Mitchell had stood at the edge of Millbrook with nowhere to go, she found herself returning to the town as a federal witness in the largest public corruption trial in the state's history. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was now staying in the same hotel where bank officials had once met to plan the foreclosure schemes that had destroyed her family's life. The Millbrook County Courthouse had been transformed into the center of national attention. CNN, NPR, and major newspapers had sent correspondents to cover what legal experts were calling a landmark case in housing rights and municipal corruption. The trial had already produced 3 guilty pleas from city council members and the resignation of Mayor Patricia Wainwright, who faced federal charges in a separate proceeding. Sarah sat in the witness waiting room, reviewing her testimony notes, while Thomas kept the triplets entertained with quiet games. At 5 years old now, Emma, Jake, and Lucy had grown into confident, articulate children whose testimony about their family's experience had moved even hardened court reporters to tears during preliminary hearings. Mrs. Mitchell, the bailiff, appeared at the door. "They're ready for you." The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow seating in adjacent rooms connected by video feed. Sarah recognized faces from her past life. Former neighbors who had turned away when she'd needed help. Teachers from the library who had whispered about her poor choices. Even some of the social workers who had threatened to separate her family. But she also saw new faces that represented hope. Families from across the region who had been similarly victimized by predatory foreclosure practices. Housing advocates who had traveled from other states to witness what they hoped would be a precedent-setting victory. Journalists who had spent months documenting the systematic failures that allowed such corruption to flourish. Margaret Chen stood at the prosecution table, her silver hair catching the courtroom lights as she organized documents that represented 2 years of meticulous investigation. Beside her, federal prosecutor Janet Rodriguez reviewed the criminal charges that could send bank president Robert Thornton to federal prison for up to 20 years. "The prosecution calls Sarah Mitchell," Margaret announced. Sarah walked to the witness stand with steady steps, her hand firm on the Bible as she swore to tell the truth. Looking out at the packed courtroom, she saw Thomas's encouraging nod, the triplets' faces bright with pride in their mother, and dozens of other families, whose stories intersected with her own. "Mrs. Mitchell," Margaret began, "please tell the court about the events that led to your family's homelessness in December of 2023. For the next 4 hours, Sarah recounted her family's experience with the precision of someone who had lived through hell and emerged with perfect clarity about what had happened and why. She described David's death, the mounting medical bills, her desperate attempts to find work and childcare, and the systematic denial of assistance by institutions that claimed to exist for exactly her situation. But this time, her testimony was supported by documentary evidence that revealed the conspiracy behind her family's suffering. Bank emails discussing the deliberate withholding of insurance information, city council recordings revealing plans to encourage demographic transitions through housing policy, financial records showing the direct connection between foreclosed properties and developer profits. "Mrs. Mitchell," Margaret asked, "when you stood outside Millbrook in that blizzard with your 3 children, what were you thinking?" Sarah paused, remembering that moment of complete desperation when every door had been closed to her family. "I was thinking that I had failed as a mother," she said quietly, "that somehow I wasn't smart enough or strong enough to protect my children from systems that seemed designed to destroy families like ours. And what do you think now? I think those systems were working exactly as they were designed to work." Sarah replied, her voice carrying new strength. "They were designed to transfer wealth from vulnerable families to politically connected developers, and they succeeded perfectly until someone decided to shine a light on what was happening." The defense cross-examination was led by Harrison Blake, whose reputation for aggressive tactics had been somewhat diminished by the overwhelming evidence against his clients. His questions focused on Sarah's current living situation, trying to suggest that her comfortable life at Thomas's compound undermined her claims of hardship. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Mitchell, that you're currently living in a luxury mountain retreat with solar power, gourmet kitchen facilities, and extensive recreational amenities?" "I'm living in a refuge created by someone who understood that families need safety and stability to rebuild their lives," Sarah replied. "The fact that Thomas Whitehorse built something beautiful doesn't change the fact that my family was illegally evicted from our home." Blake pressed harder, trying to paint Thomas's network as some sort of criminal organization that had motivated Sarah's testimony. "Isn't it true that Mr. Whitehorse operates an unlicensed social services network that circumvents official oversight?" Margaret's objection was sustained, but Sarah had already prepared for this line of attack. Thomas Whitehorse does what our government claims to do, but fails to accomplish. He helps families in crisis without judging whether they deserve assistance. The courtroom erupted in applause, which Judge Patricia Morrison quickly gavelled down. But the moment had crystallized something important about the case. Sarah Mitchell was no longer a victim pleading for sympathy. She had become an advocate challenging fundamental assumptions about how society should treat its most vulnerable. Members, when Sarah's testimony concluded, the prosecution called Thomas Whitehorse to the stand. His appearance created a visible stir in the courtroom. Many Millbrook residents hadn't seen the former doctor in over 30 years, and his transformation from medical professional to mountain hermit had become local legend. Thomas's testimony focused on the systemic failures that had motivated him to create his alternative network. He described watching family after family destroyed by the same combination of economic pressure and institutional indifference that had nearly claimed the Mitchells. "Your Honor," Thomas said, addressing Judge Morrison directly, "I became a doctor because I believed in healing. When I could no longer practice medicine, I found other ways to heal, not just individual families, but the communities that had failed them." The defense attempted to portray Thomas as a vigilante operating outside legal authority, but his calm responses and detailed knowledge of housing law, social services and child welfare regulations undermined their strategy. He wasn't a radical activist. He was a professional who had simply found more effective ways to accomplish what government agencies claimed to be doing. "Mr. Whitehorse," Prosecutor Rodriguez asked, "in your experience, how many families could have been saved if existing systems had functioned as intended?" "All of them," Thomas replied without hesitation. "Every family I've helped was destroyed by preventable failures, bureaucratic delays, deliberately withheld information, or officials who prioritized political connections over public service." The trial's turning point came when Margaret presented evidence that Bank President Thornton had personal financial interests in 3 of the companies that had purchased foreclosed properties. The revelation that he had directly profited from the illegal foreclosure practices transformed the case from regulatory violations into clear criminal fraud. Dr. Jessica Martinez testified about the psychological damage inflicted on children by predatory housing practices, using the Triplets recovery progress to demonstrate both the harm caused by displacement and the healing possible with stable housing. Her testimony was particularly powerful because it connected individual trauma to broader social costs. "When we destroy families through illegal foreclosure practices," Dr. Martinez explained, "we create long-term mental health problems, educational disruption, and social instability that cost society far more than providing appropriate assistance would have cost initially." The prosecution's final witness was David Park, whose investigative journalism had exposed the connections between the foreclosure conspiracy and similar schemes in other communities. His testimony revealed that the Millbrook case was part of a regional pattern of corruption that had affected thousands of families across multiple states. "This isn't an isolated case of local misconduct," Park testified. "It's part of a systematic transfer of wealth from working families to politically connected developers, enabled by public officials who were supposed to protect their constituents." The defense's case lasted only 3 days, hampered by the guilty pleas from key co-conspirators and the overwhelming documentary evidence. Their strategy focused on arguing that any misconduct was the result of individual bad actors rather than systematic corruption, but the prosecution's evidence made such claims difficult to sustain. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges. Bank President Thornton was convicted of fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. Mayor Wainwright, tried separately, was convicted on corruption charges. Several city council members faced additional trials on related charges, but the legal victory was only part of what Sarah had accomplished. The case had generated national attention to housing rights issues and inspired legislative reforms in multiple states. Federal banking regulators had implemented new oversight procedures designed to prevent similar foreclosure schemes. The Department of Justice had announced a nationwide investigation into predatory municipal practices. More importantly, for families facing similar crises, Thomas's network had expanded significantly. The publicity from the trial had connected his organization with established advocacy groups, legal aid societies, and policy researchers. What had begun as one man's response to personal tragedy had evolved into a regional movement for housing justice. The financial settlement exceeded even Margaret's optimistic projections. The bank was ordered to pay damages not just to the Mitchell family, but to every family affected by their illegal practices. A federal monitor was appointed to oversee the bank's foreclosure procedures for the next 5 years. The city of Millbrook faced massive civil penalties and was required to establish a housing assistance fund for vulnerable families. Sarah used her portion of the settlement to establish the David Mitchell Foundation, which provided emergency housing assistance and legal representation for families facing foreclosure. The foundation's first project was purchasing and renovating the home on Elm Street, where her family had lived before David's death. But they didn't move back to Millbrook. The compound in the mountains had become their true home, and the children had no desire to leave the place where they'd learned to feel safe and valued. Emma was now helping younger children who occasionally stayed at the compound with their families. Jake had become Thomas's apprentice in the workshop, learning carpentry, skills that connected him to his father's memory. Lucy had discovered a talent for botanical illustration and was documenting the plant life in their mountain valley. "Do you ever regret fighting instead of just disappearing?" Thomas asked Sarah one evening as they watched the children play in the meadow behind the compound. Sarah considered the question while observing her children's confident, joyful interactions. "No," she said finally. "Fighting meant they got to grow up knowing that injustice doesn't have to be accepted, that ordinary people can challenge powerful institutions and win." The compound had evolved as well. What had once been Thomas's private refuge had become a model for alternative approaches to family services. Social work students came for internships, learning about community-based support systems that prioritized family preservation over bureaucratic compliance. Policy researchers studied the compound's governance structures and resource allocation methods. Other communities had begun developing similar refugees, using Thomas's architectural plans and organizational principles. 3 years after that desperate winter night, Sarah Mitchell stood in the same meadow where Thomas had first brought her family to safety, watching Emma teach younger children about sustainable gardening while Jake demonstrated the wood-turning techniques he'd mastered. Lucy sat nearby, sketching the wildflowers that bloomed each spring in impossible abundance. The legal battles had ended with complete victory. The systemic changes they'd fought for were being implemented across multiple states. Other families were receiving the help that had been denied to the Mitchells. But the real victory was quieter and more personal. 3 children who had faced homelessness and family separation were growing into confident, capable young people who understood both their own worth and their responsibility to help others. A widow who had been told she was incapable of caring for her family had become a national advocate for housing rights. A broken system had been forced to confront its fundamental failures and begin the slow work of reform. As the sun set behind the mountain peaks that sheltered their hidden valley, Sarah realized that they had found something rarer than justice. They had found home in its truest sense. Not just a place to live, but a community built on the radical idea that every family deserved safety, dignity, and the chance to build a future worth believing in. The blizzard that had once threatened to destroy them had ultimately led them to discover that even in a world that often seemed designed to crush the vulnerable, there were still people willing to build shelters for those who had nowhere else to go. And sometimes, if you were very fortunate, those shelters became the foundation for something even more precious. They became home. 5 years had passed since the landmark court victory, and Sarah Mitchell's life had taken directions she never could have imagined during those desperate winter months. The David Mitchell Foundation had grown from a small family initiative into a nationally recognized organization that had prevented over 3,000 foreclosures and helped establish similar networks in 42 states. Sarah's office occupied the top floor of a converted warehouse in Denver, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of the Rocky Mountains that reminded her daily of the sanctuary that had saved her family. The walls displayed framed photographs of families who had been helped by the foundation, children who had avoided foster care separation, and communities that had implemented Thomas's model of mutual aid networks. But the most meaningful image wasn't framed. It was a drawing Lucy had made at age 7, showing their mountain compound surrounded by other families' homes, all connected by paths that led to a central gathering place. The drawing had become the foundation's unofficial logo, representing the vision of interconnected communities supporting each other through crisis and growth. Mrs. Mitchell, the Senate subcommittee is ready for your testimony, her assistant announced from the doorway. Sarah gathered her prepared remarks, the same manila folder style she'd used during the original trial, though now it contained policy recommendations that could affect millions of families rather than just her own. The Senate Banking Committee had invited her to testify about proposed federal legislation that would standardize foreclosure procedures and establish emergency housing assistance programs nationwide. The hearing room in Washington, D.C. was smaller than the courtroom where she'd first told her story, but the stakes were arguably higher. The legislation under consideration would codify many of the reforms that had emerged from the Millbrook case, but it faced opposition from banking lobbyists who argued that increased oversight would stifle economic growth. Senator Davidson, Sarah began, addressing the committee chairman, 5 years ago, my family was hours away from freezing to death because multiple systems designed to help vulnerable families failed simultaneously. Today, we have the opportunity to ensure that no other family faces that same combination of institutional failures. Her testimony drew on data collected by the Foundation's research division, but Sarah had learned that statistics alone rarely changed minds. Instead, she wove individual stories throughout her presentation. Families saved by early intervention, children who had grown up in stable housing because proper assistance had been provided, communities that had thrived when mutual aid networks supplemented traditional social services. The Hendersons in Montana, Sarah explained, were facing foreclosure when their daughter's cancer treatments depleted their savings. Under current inconsistent regulations, they might have lost their home despite having insurance that should have covered their situation. Under the proposed legislation, standardized procedures would have identified their coverage immediately. Senator Rebecca Martinez, who had sponsored the legislation, asked about implementation challenges. Mrs. Mitchell, critics argue that federal oversight would create bureaucratic delays that could actually harm families in crisis. How do you respond to those concerns? Sarah had anticipated this question, having heard variations of it in dozens of similar hearings. Senator, the current system already creates delays, but those delays benefit predatory lenders rather than vulnerable families. What we're proposing is accountability, not additional bureaucracy. She clicked to the next slide in her presentation, showing a map of the United States with different colors indicating varying levels of foreclosure protection. A family facing a housing crisis in California currently has very different rights than an identical family in Texas. This legislation would establish minimum federal standards while allowing states to provide additional protections. The hearing lasted 6 hours, with Sarah fielding questions from senators representing both rural farming communities and urban centers. The diversity of perspectives reminded her that housing insecurity affected families across all demographics and political affiliations, something she'd learned firsthand through the Foundation's work. During breaks, Sarah found herself thinking about the triplets, now 10 years old, and attending a small school near the mountain compound that Thomas had helped establish for children from several alternative communities in the region. Emma had developed into a natural mediator, often helping resolve conflicts between classmates with wisdom that seemed beyond her years. Jake had inherited his father's mechanical aptitude and was already designing improvements to the compound's renewable energy systems. Lucy had become the family historian, documenting their story through art and writing that captured nuances adults often missed. The children's perspectives on their unconventional upbringing often surprised visitors to the compound. They didn't see themselves as victims of tragedy or beneficiaries of unusual charity. They simply understood that families sometimes needed help and that communities worked best when people took care of each other. "We lived in a regular house once," Jake had explained to a documentary filmmaker the previous year, "but our mountain house is better because if someone needs help, there's always room for them." That evening, Sarah called the compound from her hotel room in Washington, connecting via the satellite communication system that Thomas had installed years earlier. The triplets took turns sharing their day. Emma had helped a new family settle into one of the compound's guest cabins. Jake had successfully repaired a solar panel inverter, and Lucy had completed a series of paintings depicting the seasonal changes in their valley. "How did the hearing go, Mum?" Emma asked, her 10-year-old voice carrying the same serious tone she'd had as a toddler. "I think we made progress," Sarah replied. "A lot of senators seemed genuinely interested in preventing other families from experiencing what we went through." "Good," Jake said pragmatically, "but they should visit Uncle Thomas if they really want to understand how to help families." Thomas's influence on the children was profound and positive, but Sarah sometimes wondered if their mountain sanctuary had prepared them adequately for the complexities of the outside world. They had grown up in a community where adults consistently prioritized children's welfare, where resources were shared based on need rather than ability to pay, and where conflicts were resolved through communication rather than authority. Dr. Martinez, who still visited regularly to document the children's development, had consistently reported that they were thriving academically, socially, and emotionally. But she also noted that their worldview reflected their unusual upbringing. They expected adults to be trustworthy, assumed that communities would support struggling members, and approach problems with collaborative solutions rather than competitive strategies. They're being raised in a community that actually functions according to the values most societies claim to hold, Dr. Martinez had explained during her most recent evaluation. The question isn't whether they're prepared for the real world, it's whether the real world is ready for children who've been raised to believe that cooperation and mutual aid are normal. The Senate legislation passed committee by a narrow margin, but its prospects in the full chamber remained uncertain. Banking industry lobbyists had mounted a sophisticated campaign arguing that increased foreclosure protections would restrict credit availability and harm economic growth. Sarah had learned to navigate these political battles with the same strategic thinking that had helped her survive the original court case. But her real focus remained on the practical work of helping individual families. The foundation now operated regional offices in 12 states, each staffed by people who had been helped by Thomas's network and had chosen to dedicate themselves to assisting others. The model was intentionally decentralized. Local coordinators understood their community's specific needs and could respond quickly to emerging crises. Maria Santos, who directed the Foundation's Southwest Regional Office, had been facing eviction with her 4 children when Sarah's organization intervened 3 years earlier. Now she coordinated assistance for families across Arizona and New Mexico, using her personal experience to identify solutions that bureaucratic social workers often missed. The difference, Maria had explained during the Foundation's annual conference, is that we remember what it feels like to be desperate. We don't judge whether families deserve help. We just figure out how to provide it. This philosophy sometimes put the Foundation at odds with traditional social service agencies, which were bound by eligibility requirements and procedural restrictions that could prevent assistance even when families clearly needed help. Sarah had learned to work within existing systems while also creating alternatives for families who fell through official cracks. The Foundation's emergency housing program had evolved into something unique in the social services landscape. Rather than operating shelters, they maintained a network of private homes, converted buildings, and purpose-built refuges like Thomas's compound, where families could stay while addressing the underlying causes of their housing instability. Traditional homeless shelters are designed around the assumption that homelessness is a temporary condition requiring minimal intervention, Sarah had explained to the Senate committee. Our model recognizes that families facing a housing crisis need comprehensive support, childcare, job training, legal assistance, and time to rebuild financial stability. The Foundation's success had attracted attention from researchers studying alternative approaches to poverty intervention. Several universities had established partnerships to study the long-term outcomes for families who received comprehensive support compared to those who navigated traditional systems. Preliminary results were encouraging. Families assisted by the Foundation were significantly less likely to experience repeat housing crises, more likely to achieve financial stability, and reported higher levels of satisfaction with their children's educational and social development. The research was still ongoing, but early findings suggested that intensive short-term support produced better outcomes than extended minimal assistance. Sarah's personal transformation over the past 5 years had been as dramatic as her family's changed circumstances. The widow, who had once stood helpless in a blizzard, had become a nationally recognized advocate whose testimony influenced federal policy. She regularly spoke at conferences, consulted with government agencies, and collaborated with researchers, developing new approaches to family services. But she had also maintained the values that Thomas's community had taught her. Success hadn't isolated her from the families she served. She still personally responded to crisis calls, still opened her own home to families needing temporary shelter, and still measured her achievements by individual lives changed rather than abstract policy victories. The Foundation's work had also revealed the broader scope of Thomas's network, which had grown far beyond what Sarah had initially understood. Across the Mountain West, dozens of refugees provided sanctuary for families in crisis. Former beneficiaries had established their own assistance programs. A generation of children raised in alternative communities was beginning to influence mainstream institutions. We're not trying to replace government social services, Thomas had explained during a rare public interview. We're demonstrating what's possible when communities take responsibility for their most vulnerable members. The ripple effects continued spreading. The small school near the compound had become a model for rural education, combining traditional academics with practical skills, and environmental education. The sustainable building techniques Thomas had developed were being adapted for affordable housing projects across the region. The governance structures that had evolved within the network were being studied by political scientists interested in grassroots democracy. As Sarah prepared to return to Colorado after the Senate hearing, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from desperation to influence. The blizzard that had once threatened to destroy her family had ultimately led to discoveries about human resilience, community responsibility, and the possibility of creating alternatives to systems that failed society's most vulnerable members. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Emma. "Uncle Thomas says the northern lights might be visible tonight. Lucy wants to paint them and Jake thinks he can build a better camera mount. Come home soon." Home. The word carried different meaning now than it had during those desperate months when Sarah had been fighting simply to keep her family together. Home wasn't just shelter from physical elements. It was membership in a community that prioritized each member's welfare, relationships built on mutual support rather than economic transactions, and the security that came from knowing that help would always be available when needed. The compound in the mountains remained their sanctuary, but Sarah realized that they had also helped create something larger, a network of homes that provided safety for families who had nowhere else to turn. The model was spreading, adapted to different regions and circumstances, but maintaining the core principle that every family deserves dignity, support, and the opportunity to rebuild their lives. Outside her hotel window, Washington, D.C. bustled, with the energy of a city where policies were made that affected millions of lives. But Sarah's heart was already traveling west, toward mountains that sheltered a community where those policies were tested against the simple question of whether they actually helped children sleep safely in their beds each night. 10 years after that fateful winter night, the mountain compound had transformed into something Thomas Whitehorse had never originally envisioned. What began as a refuge for one desperate family had evolved into a thriving, intentional community of 43 residents spanning 4 generations, each contributing their unique skills to a collective that had become a model for sustainable living and mutual aid. Sarah stood on the observation deck that Jake had designed and built for his Eagle Scout project, watching the sunrise illuminate a valley that now hosted multiple interconnected structures. The original compound remained the community's heart, but organic growth had added workshops, educational facilities, a medical clinic, and residential units that accommodated families of various sizes and needs. The triplets, now 15 years old, were preparing for a milestone that would have seemed impossible during their early childhood. They were leaving the mountain sanctuary for their first extended venture into the outside world. All 3 had been accepted into a summer program at Colorado State University, where they would spend 6 weeks studying sustainable engineering, environmental science, and social policy. "Are you nervous about leaving?" Sarah asked Emma, who was methodically packing equipment for her environmental research project. Emma paused, considering the question with the same thoughtful approach she brought to every major decision. "Not nervous exactly," she replied, "more like curious about how the rest of the world works compared to here." At 15, Emma had developed into a natural leader whose diplomatic skills had helped resolve conflicts not just within their community, but between their network and various government agencies. She'd already been invited to speak at 3 universities about alternative education models and had co-authored a paper on youth leadership in intentional communities. Jake emerged from his workshop carrying a prototype water purification system he'd designed for communities lacking reliable infrastructure. His mechanical genius had expanded beyond simple repairs to innovative engineering solutions that address problems he'd identified through the network's relief work. "The university professors want to see this in action," Jake said, carefully securing his invention in a custom-built travel case. "They think it could help communities dealing with contaminated water supplies." Lucy appeared from the art studio. She'd established in a converted storage building, her portfolio bulging with 10 years' worth of documentation showing the community's growth and the natural cycles of their mountain environment. Her artistic work had evolved from simple childhood drawings to sophisticated visual narratives that captured the social and environmental dynamics of alternative communities. "I'm mostly excited about the art program," Lucy admitted. "I want to learn techniques for preserving oral histories and community stories that I can bring back and teach others." Thomas, now 72, moved with slightly less agility than during the early years, but his mind remained sharp and his commitment to the community's welfare as strong as ever. He'd gradually transitioned leadership responsibilities to younger members, including Sarah, while maintaining his role as the community's elder and primary connection to their founding principles. 10 years ago, I thought I was building a refuge," Thomas reflected, as the community gathered for the morning meeting that had become their daily ritual. "I never imagined we'd create a laboratory for reimagining how human communities could function." The morning meetings had evolved into complex discussions involving residents, extended network members participating via video conference, and visiting researchers studying various aspects of their social experiment. Today's agenda included updates from affiliated communities in 7 states, planning for the annual network gathering that would bring together representatives from 43 allied communities, and strategic discussions about recent legislative developments affecting alternative communities. Dr. Martinez, who had relocated permanently to the compound 5 years earlier to establish the community's research and education center, presented data from their longitudinal study of children raised in intentional communities. The results continued to exceed expectations across every measured category: academic achievement, social development, emotional resilience, and environmental awareness. "We're seeing something unprecedented," Dr. Martinez explained to the assembled community. "Children raised in cooperative environments demonstrate superior problem-solving abilities, stronger collaborative skills, and more sophisticated understanding of resource management compared to their peers in traditional settings." The study had attracted international attention, with delegations from Scandinavian countries, indigenous communities from multiple continents, and urban planners from major cities visiting to observe their model. The compound had inadvertently become a center for research into post-industrial community organization. But Sarah's focus remained on the practical impact they were having on individual families. The David Mitchell Foundation had expanded beyond housing assistance to comprehensive family support services that addressed the interconnected challenges of poverty, social isolation, and institutional failure. Their most recent annual report documented assistance provided to over 12,000 families across 23 states. Mrs. Mitchell called Maria Santos via video conference from the Foundation's Phoenix office. "We've got a situation developing in New Mexico that might require mountain refuge placement. Single mother with twin toddlers facing eviction due to medical bankruptcy, no family support system." Sarah nodded, already mentally reviewing available resources. "Send me the details. We can accommodate them in the south cabin within 48 hours if needed." These crisis interventions had become routine, but Sarah never lost sight of how each case represented a family facing the same desperation she'd experienced. The difference was that now there were systems in place to catch families before they fell through society's cracks. The community's economic model had also proven unexpectedly successful. Thomas's furniture business had expanded into a cooperative enterprise employing dozens of artisans who created custom pieces marketed as community craft collective products. The premium prices they commanded in urban markets supported not just individual families, but the entire network's assistance programs. Jake's engineering innovations had created another revenue stream, with his designs being licensed to municipalities and non-profits worldwide. Water purification systems, renewable energy solutions, and sustainable building techniques developed in their mountain laboratory were now improving living conditions in communities across 6 continents. Lucy's artistic documentation had evolved into multimedia projects that generated income through book sales, documentary licensing, and educational materials used by schools and universities. Her work provided crucial historical documentation of alternative community development, while funding ongoing research and assistance programs. Emma's diplomatic work had opened doors to government partnerships that would have been impossible during the network's underground years. She'd successfully negotiated agreements with federal agencies to study their community models for potential policy applications, while maintaining the independence that allowed them to operate according to their own values. The Senate legislation Sarah had supported 3 years earlier had finally passed, establishing federal standards for foreclosure procedures and creating emergency assistance programs modeled on the Foundation's work. Implementation was still challenging, but families now had legal protections that hadn't existed during the Millbrook crisis. "Sometimes I think about parallel universes," Sarah said during the evening gathering that had replaced their old fireside conversations. "In one timeline, we froze to death in that car 10 years ago. In another, Thomas never built this place. In another, we fought the legal battle, but lost." The community had developed traditions around storytelling, with residents sharing both personal histories and speculative futures. These conversations served therapeutic, educational, and planning purposes simultaneously. But in this timeline, Thomas added, one family's crisis became the catalyst for helping thousands of other families. Individual tragedy became collective transformation. The approaching departure of the triplets had prompted community-wide reflection on growth, change, and continuity. For the first time since their arrival, core community members would be absent for an extended period. The children who had learned to walk in these mountains, who had been educated by the entire community, who embodied the values they'd all worked to establish, would test those values in the outside world. "What if we discover that the regular world is better than we thought?" Lucy asked during one of their family planning sessions. "What if we've been living in isolation from opportunities we should have been pursuing?" It was Emma who provided the perspective that had emerged from their unusual upbringing. "We're not going out there to discover whether their world is better than ours," she said. "We're going to learn what's useful from their approaches so we can bring those insights back and make our world even better." Jake nodded in agreement. "Plus, maybe we can share some of our ideas with people who haven't had the chance to see alternatives to the regular way of doing things." As summer approached, the community prepared for changes that went beyond the triplets' temporary absence. 3 new families had requested long-term placement, requiring expansion of housing and educational facilities. A documentary crew was planning a year-long residency to create a comprehensive film about intentional community development. 2 universities had proposed establishing satellite research programs at the compound. Sarah found herself in the unexpected position of managing growth rather than crisis. The skills she'd developed fighting for her family's survival had evolved into expertise in organizational leadership, resource allocation, and strategic planning. The widow who had once felt powerless to protect her children had become someone capable of creating systems that protected hundreds of children. But the most meaningful transformation was personal. Sarah had learned to trust not just individual relationships, but community structures that distributed responsibility and ensured continuity. She no longer carried the weight of her family's security alone. They were embedded in networks of mutual support that could adapt to changing circumstances. "Do you ever miss the simplicity of those early days?" Thomas asked, as they walked the perimeter trail that connected all the community's scattered buildings. Sarah considered the question while observing the complex choreography of community life, children playing games that spanned multiple age groups, adults collaborating on projects that combined practical necessity with creative expression, elders sharing knowledge with younger community members through informal mentorship relationships. "I miss the clarity of simple survival," she admitted. "When the only question was whether we'd make it through each day, decisions were easier. Now we're trying to figure out how to help other communities develop similar support systems, how to influence policy at state and federal levels, how to prepare our children for leadership roles they never asked for." "But you don't regret the complexity?" "No," Sarah said without hesitation, "because the complexity means we're not just surviving anymore. We're creating possibilities for families who haven't even been born yet." The evening before the triplets' departure, the community organized a celebration that reflected their unique culture. There were speeches recognizing the children's contributions to community life, presentations of gifts that represented relationships with every community member, and storytelling that connected their personal journey to the larger narrative of social transformation. But the most moving moment came when Emma, Jake, and Lucy presented their own gifts to the community, a collaborative project they'd worked on in secret for months. Emma had written a comprehensive guide to youth leadership in intentional communities. Jake had designed and built playground equipment specifically adapted for the community's mixed-age educational approach. Lucy had created a series of murals depicting the community's history, from Thomas's original vision through its current incarnation. "This place saved our lives," Emma said, speaking for all three siblings. "But more than that, it taught us that we could help save other people's lives too. We're not leaving. We're expanding our definition of home to include the rest of the world." As Sarah watched her children prepare for their first extended journey beyond the mountains that had sheltered them, she realized that they represented something unprecedented. A generation raised to believe that community welfare took precedence over individual advantage, that problems were opportunities for collaborative solutions, that society's most vulnerable members deserved comprehensive support rather than temporary charity. The blizzard that had once threatened to destroy her family had ultimately led to the creation of something much larger than personal security. It had catalyzed the development of alternative approaches to community organization, family support, and social responsibility that were spreading far beyond their mountain sanctuary. Standing on the observation deck as dawn broke over their valley for the 10,000th time since that desperate winter night, Sarah understood that their story had never really been about one family's survival. It had been about discovering that ordinary people possessed extraordinary capacity for creating the changes they needed to see in the world. The triplets would carry those discoveries into universities, careers, and communities that still operated. According to assumptions about scarcity, competition, and individual responsibility, they would encounter people who had never experienced alternatives to systems that failed society's most vulnerable members. But they would also carry the knowledge that alternatives were possible, that communities could organize around cooperation rather than competition, and that individual crises could become catalysts for collective transformation. As the sun climbed higher, illuminating the network of paths that connected their community's scattered buildings, Sarah saw not just the physical infrastructure they'd built, but the social architecture that had made their survival and growth possible. Children played in gardens that provided food security. Adults collaborated on projects that generated both income and social value. Elders shared wisdom that connected present innovations to traditional knowledge. 10 years after a desperate widow had stood in a blizzard with nowhere to go, her children were preparing to venture into the world as ambassadors for the radical idea that every family deserved safety, dignity, and community support. The refuge that had saved them was now generating the next generation of leaders who would continue expanding the definition of home to include everyone who needed sanctuary from the storms of modern life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.